Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. I'm Dani, and today Great.com talks with Amanda Kippert, the editorial director of DomesticShelters.org. If you haven't heard of it yet, they work to make more people aware of the services available for those experiencing domestic violence and make it faster and easier for the victims and their friends and family to get help they need. Now, if you're new here to this podcast, remember to press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app. And hello, Amanda, and welcome to our podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
It's totally our pleasure. I always say that domestic violence is something that I feel like we don't talk about enough. And it's really, really good that you have this initiative, like you're working with this initiative to raise the awareness about the resources and what is exactly domestic violence. We're going to go there in a few minutes, but let's begin knowing more about you, about your story, and how did you get involved in this?
Sure. Well, I've been a journalist my whole professional life. And for the last about 10 years or so, I've focused on domestic violence or violence against women as a topic. And so I hooked up with DomesticShelters.org when they began in 2014, and I started writing for them as their editorial director. It's just a cause that's always been really, really important to me. Like you said, I don't feel like there's enough awareness about it. I feel like it's one of those things that people don't really focus on unless it affects them directly. And then when it does, they get real passionate about it and they want everything to be focused on it and they want it to stop. But the issue that, we're trying to raise is that we need to be more proactive on domestic violence and curbing it before it affects the number of victims that it does every year.
Well, yes, absolutely. And let's try to understand or help our listeners here to understand more about what exactly is abuse and what is the cycle of the abuse, because I believe it kind of goes in a cycle before the person can break free. Is that correct?
Oftentimes, not always, but often. Survivors of domestic violence will notice that their abusive partner follows a cycle of abuse. And the tricky part about abuse is that it doesn't start off with a bang. People don't meet someone and immediately identify them as an abusive partner and then say, great, I'm going to marry them. Like, they start off very charming, very gregarious. There's a concept called love bombing, where they will shower this partner with adoration, everything that they like, the partner likes, everything they're into, the partner also happens to be into, and before you know it, you're just head over heels in love. And then there's typically an escalation. That abusive partner will get a little bit more jealous, let's say, a little bit more protective under the guise of caring for that partner, when actually it's just a form of power and control. And that will escalate until typically there's an incident. And that incident can be physical or it might not be physical, because not all domestic violence is physical abuse. Sometimes it is just an explosion of verbal abuse. Sometimes it's just a very quiet psychological abusive cycle where that partner just starts questioning their own reality. That's called gaslighting, or feeling teared down, or feeling degraded. And so that incident can happen, and then the survivor will start to think, something's off about this. I don't suddenly feel safe. Who is this person that I knew? Like, where is that loving, caring, romantic person that I once met? Then sometimes, but not always, the abuser might try to apologize. The love bombing might start again. It'll never happen again. Like, you're the only one that can help me with this. Like, I'm going to get my anger under control. It's us against the world, and everything will seem lovey-dovey. Some people call this the honeymoon phase. And that will be the part that the survivor will always try to get back to, because that's the best part of the relationship, right? But then it starts again. The escalation, things start to get more tense, more stressed. Then another incident happens and it starts all over.
Wow, it's really complicated to truly break free, because I believe that it affects so many different areas, not only just the relationship, but also like self-love and this idea of being able to live by oneself. So it's really intricate. And considering all of that context, what was the moment that DomesticShelters.org began its work, and what is the help that you're trying to offer to the victims?
Well, Domestic Shelters, I should say, is part of a nonprofit called Teresa's Fund. And that was started in 1992 by a man named Preston McMurray. And that was originated in Arizona to give large grants to nonprofits in the area that were doing fantastic things to help survivors. And then in 2014, this innovative project, DomesticShelters.org, began. It's the first of its kind. And what they wanted to do was create an online directory of every domestic violence shelter throughout the entire US and Canada. And that way people could go to one website, type in their zip code, and find a shelter that was near them. And not just shelter, but advocates that they could call on a 24-hour helpline. Because oftentimes, there is a national domestic violence hotline, and that is great, but it's often I want to say overrun, but it has such a heavy volume of calls that sometimes it is better to call your local domestic violence shelter. Not only can you get through maybe easier, but they're going to have local resources for you. So if you need housing assistance, financial assistance, lay legal help, things like that, calling someone local to you might be a better bet. So they created DomesticShelters.org to be this hub where people could go and find help, but then also to be a place for news and information about domestic violence. So we have hundreds and hundreds of articles on every single facet of domestic violence that you could ever think possible. The sad part is we never run out of content because there's just always something to cover and talk about, and something new, some new tactic abusers are using, or something new that survivors are experiencing. So those two things together, the directory and then the information. Domestic Shelters also has a bevy of webinars for professionals and none alike to be trained in facets of domestic violence. We have something called the Purple Ribbon Awards, where we hand out annual awards to people in the movement who are doing a great job, and we recognize them and their organizations. There's a wish list program. So if you want to go on there and help a shelter anywhere in the country, you can look them up, and they'll have an Amazon wish list and go right to it and send them whatever they need. So that's another way that we're trying to help out. Just all sorts of things like that.
Oh, that's incredible. And well, although you made a list, I truly invite people here to go to the website, because either if you are in trouble, or you know anyone in trouble, or you just want to get educated, I think this kind of education is never enough. Unfortunately, as you mentioned earlier, we are all, we could all be in this situation eventually. Abusers do not walk around with a tag, right? That identifies themselves, just as you said. So go to this website, DomesticShelters.org, and you can get all of this information. And as you said, a lot of resources that explains us and help us to understand more about abusive situations. And you said that you see, well, unfortunately, you don't run out of content for this website, and people keep reinventing new ways to abuse. Let's try to understand this a little bit more, because I know that during the pandemic, there was a huge increase in numbers of domestic violence, not only happening, but also being reported, right? What do you believe that stimulates this sort of rises, this sort of new ways to, abuse people? What is behind all of that? It always got me very curious.
Well, during the pandemic specifically, we saw an increase in stress around the world because it's a pandemic. So, and then we also saw the quarantine concurrently run with that. So people were trapped at home with an abusive partner. If neither of them could go to work, it was a lot more time together where the abuse could occur. Also, it put a financial strain on a lot of families, and financial abuse is present in almost every incident of domestic statistics. So financially, if you are trapped with an abusive partner, that's another reason why you can't leave. One of the main frustrations, just for me as a journalist, is to hear over and over sort of this excuse, well, if it's really that bad, then the survivor would just leave. And if they're staying, then it must not be that bad. But they don't take into account all the different barriers and reasons why people can't leave. And the pandemic highlighted that, because one, where are you going to go during a quarantine? And two, what are you going to do if you can't afford to live on your own and you have children that you can't afford to pay for without your partner's dual income? So for those reasons, a lot of survivors feel like they're trapped between a rock and a hard place. They either stay with their abuser, who allows them to live in a home comfortably with their children, not comfortably, because nothing's comfortable about abuse, but they have everything financially that they might need, or they try to go out on their own and potentially be homeless or lose custody of their children. So it's really, really difficult just to tell survivors just leave, because it's never going to be that simple. And another reason why survivors have a hard time leaving is because a lot of them are very fearful that if they do, they'll be killed. Because a lot of the most dangerous time for a survivor is when they decide to leave, unfortunately, because that's when the abuser loses control of the survivor. And because of that, they tend to ramp up their abusive tactics. So that's when the survivor is most at risk. So now that survivor is contemplating in their head, do I stay with this known danger that I have some tiny bit of control over in my head, or do I leave unknowingly, walk into God knows what, and potentially be killed or put my children at risk? There's just so much complexity to domestic violence that I think people underestimate just how horribly difficult it is for survivors to walk out the door.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And this raises this question that what happens after the abuse, right? Because breaking free is just one step. Things, as you just mentioned, tends to get worse after that. And the DomesticShelters.org also provides information on how can people get back in shape, get protected after it happens. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to sound like too much of a downer. Like, it absolutely is possible to leave. And we have seen and heard from hundreds of survivors who have done just that. And there is a safe way that you can leave. And that involves calling an advocate and getting the support that you need, and developing a safety plan, and using legal avenues to protect yourself and your children. And then once you're out, the healing process begins. And again, for a lot of survivors, no matter what kind of abuse it is, physical or non-physical, it can take a lifetime for a lot of information and support on how to begin that.
Well, and talking about information, you mentioned before to me that you also have a podcast, which I'm very interested in listening to later. Tell me about that. What's going on there?
Okay. Well, thanks. The podcast is called Toxic. I should say that it is not run by DomesticShelters.org. It's my own kind of side project that I wanted to do, where I can sort of speak freely, less as a journalist and more as someone who's just very passionate about this topic and ending violence against women. But Toxic focuses on issues of toxic masculinity and how it affects our everyday life. Myself and my co-host, Jenna Brandel, we call out offenders of toxic masculinity, celebrities, people in high power positions, and how what they are doing trickles down to affect all of us in our society, and what systems are in place that continue to enable men to have this sense of entitlement to have control over women.
Wow, that's a very interesting approach. I very much like that. I'm definitely gonna check it later.
It's not PG. I should also mention that. It's, no. Be prepared.
Yeah.
There's
okay.
an R.
Yeah, but I think it's also important to have like these spaces, right? Because we need to have clarity on what's going on, and real life is not so clean and simple and beautiful as we would like it to be. So we do need a space to share these stronger stories, let's say.
I agree. I think it's an issue that we need to speak really frankly about, and I don't think we can always be super polite about it, because it's really it is a crisis that is affecting us all, whether we know it or not, whether we know somebody who is being abused or not. It really is affecting us all, because we've seen domestic abusers then go become mass shooters. Stopped at the domestic violence level, then they go out and they get a bigger gun and they hurt more people. And it's going to keep escalating like that throughout our society unless we all start to recognize it and take some accountability for it.
Well, absolutely. I agree completely with you. And now, while trying to lighten up the mood a little,
Right?
What would be next for you and for domestic shelters as well? You can talk in both senses.
I'm going to keep on trucking on this route. It is, as you can tell, it's a soapbox that I enjoy getting up on because I just feel really passionate about it. And so for me, this work is really both a job and something that I'm passionate about. DomesticShelters.org is always growing. We're always developing new things. I'm not sure how much I'm able to give away, but we have some new things in the works that are really like phenomenal tools to help survivors that we haven't seen anywhere else, ways to reach people who don't realize that they're being abused, but who might have questions. I think because one of the hardest things for a lot of survivors is to, and this sounds kind of crazy, but is to recognize domestic violence. So we have a lot of people come to us and say, you know, what is happening? Because I don't feel safe and I don't feel comfortable, but this person hasn't hit me or anything. You know, and so we're creating these tools that will help walk people through what domestic violence looks like in all of its facets. And we're hoping to then reach a lot more people in the future.
That's amazing. And that also got me thinking that you need quite a structure to keep all going, because you said you work on a national and international, because you consider Canada as well, level, and you're preparing all of these new tools, and that's not cheap, I would say. How do you keep your activities going? How is the domestic shelters funded?
Well, we are funded by generous donations. That is mainly how we are funded. We don't accept government grants or anything like that, so we're all privately funded by donors. So if anybody wants to learn more about that, they can go to DomesticShelters.org. We rely so heavily on people's generosity to keep doing what we're doing and to keep providing the information that we do.
That is awesome. And I do, again, tell people to go to our website, because it's super easy to find help there. I've got to say, even I'm in Brazil, I just typed like random zip codes here that I found on Google, and the information just got so easily. So it's a very important tool, and it's incredibly easy to do, and it's safe. Above all things, it's safe. So do go there. Now, before we say goodbye here, do you have any impact story or any story that moved you in some way that you would like to share with us today?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I've talked to hundreds of survivors, and each one is just, you know, more inspiring than the last. Oh my gosh. So to call out one, I don't know.
No, that's okay. Because actually now thinking here, it must be so hard to actually pick one story, and, you know, because you're in contact with so much people, and it must affect you in so many different ways. How is that process of, you know, actually relating? I'm going to change my question here for you. Okay. How does that? That's okay. How does that impact you when you're trying to, you know, not only on the podcast, because as you said, it's more in the face, like it's blunt. How is it for you?
It's heavy. Yeah, it can be heavy. Like I feel honored that people want to disclose to me their journey through domestic violence, and I take it so seriously that responsibility to hear their stories and then to record them and publish them with their permission. And I want to give them as much power over that story, because, you know, the last thing I want to do is act as another person in their life that's trying to take control over some part of their story. So for them to trust me, it means so much to me. And there have just been so many interviews where I've had to mute the phone and collect myself, because their story is just so impactful, but I don't want them to think I'm getting too like emotionally involved in it. But their bravery, survivors of domestic violence who have been abused for years, who have wondered if they'll get out alive, if their kids will get out alive. And even talking, I mean, to the to the people whose children didn't make it out alive is the hardest one. It's phenomenal. It's the best and the worst, because you don't want to hear some of these stories, but I also want to share them so badly so that other people will begin to care about these individuals and what they've gone through and what they've fought through, so that we can help the next survivor that comes through.
I can only imagine how that must feel. So thank you for sharing with us. Thank you for joining us today. And also thank you so much for doing this work. I think it's really critical.
Well, thank you. Thank you for everything you do and for amplifying this.
It's fully my pleasure. And for everybody listening, also, thank you so much for staying with us for one more episode. And remember to press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because if you like this episode, that shows the algorithm that this is an important conversation, and then we can spread the word about the importance of DomesticShelters.org. Remember, if you're in need, if you know anyone in need, or if you just want to get educated about this, go to the website. You're going to learn a lot in there. Bye, and I'll see you at the next episode.